A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Daniel sent us this one. He's asking about Claude Managed Agents, which launched in public beta on April 8th. His question is essentially, what's the actual value proposition here? They're built on the existing Anthropic SDK, so what do they add beyond the Messages API in standard tool use? The pitch includes secure sandboxing, persistent long-running sessions that survive disconnections, multi-agent coordination where one agent spawns and directs others, scoped permissions, execution tracing, automatic checkpointing, error recovery. Essentially, the full agent harness infrastructure that Anthropic says takes months to build yourself. Daniel's asking whether this is Anthropic abstracting away the agent loop the way OpenAI did with the Assistance API, or something more interesting. Who is it actually for? And given that Anthropic built their reputation on giving developers raw models to build their own harness, is shipping a managed harness a strategic shift? He also wants the honest trade-off. Build on the SDK with your own loop versus hand that loop to Anthropic to run server-side. What do you gain? What do you give up? Where's the inflection point?
And worth mentioning, today's episode is being generated by Claude Sonnet 4.6 running directly on the Anthropic API. So we are, in a very literal sense, a product of the infrastructure we're about to critique. I find that delightful.
The recursion is not lost on me. Okay, so let's start with the thing that I think confuses people immediately, because the name is doing a lot of work. Claude Managed Agents sounds like it could just be a slightly fancier wrapper around the Messages API with a nicer dashboard. But it's not that, is it?
It's genuinely not. The key word in Anthropic's own framing is runtime contract. This is a hosted execution runtime, not an API abstraction. The architectural distinction matters enormously. When you call the Messages API, you are sending a request, get in a response, and then your code decides what to do next. Your loop, your state management, your error handling. Managed Agents inverts that. You define an agent object, the model, system prompt, tools, MCP server connections. Create an environment, which is a cloud container template with pre-installed packages and network rules, and then start a session. From that point, the loop runs on Anthropic's infrastructure, not yours.
And the environment piece is where it gets interesting, because that's not just a fancy word for conversation thread. You're talking about an actual Linux container.
A disposable, isolated Linux container, yes, with real compute, Bash access, file operations, web search, MCP connections, all available inside the session. This is the thing that makes it architecturally different from what OpenAI built with the Assistance API. OpenAI's assistants were primarily a state management layer, persistent threads, file storage, retrieval. There was no actual compute sandbox. You couldn't run arbitrary code inside an assistance execution context. Managed Agents has a real container running real code. That's a qualitative difference, not a quantitative one.
And Anthropic's framing for this is what they call brain versus hands. Claude is the reasoning layer. The container is the execution layer, which I actually think is a cleaner mental model than most of the agentic frameworks I've seen, which tend to blur those two things together in ways that make debugging a nightmare.
The model upgrade story is also much cleaner with that separation. When Claude Sonnet 4.7 ships, or whatever comes next, you don't rebuild your infrastructure. The brain upgrades, the hands stay the same. That's not a trivial benefit if you've ever had to migrate a production agent workflow to a new model version and discovered that your carefully tuned prompts behave differently and your tool call parsing breaks in subtle ways.
Okay, so let's do the honest trade-off, because Daniel specifically asked for this. What do you actually give up when you hand the loop to Anthropic?
The biggest thing is multi-model mixing, and I want to dwell on this because the Hacker News thread surfaced some genuinely insightful takes on it. There are developers who have built workflows where Opus handles planning, Gemini handles a revision pass, and then a local Quen model handles the actual code generation. One comment described a workflow. Opus writes a spec, sends it to Gemini to revise, back to Opus to fix, then to a local model to build, then Opus to review. That is a sophisticated, cost-optimized, capability-optimized pipeline. Managed agents cannot do that. It is Claude only, full stop.
And it's not available on Bedrock or Vertex either, which is a real constraint for enterprises with existing cloud commitments.
That's the quiet limitation that I think will determine the product's ceiling in the enterprise market. The customers. Anthropic is targeting regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, government adjacent are exactly the ones most likely to have data residency requirements or existing AWS or GCP commitments that make Anthropic-only infrastructure a hard blocker. Rakuten deploying 5 specialist agents in under a week each is a compelling proof point, but Rakuten is also a company that can make pragmatic infrastructure decisions quickly. A bank with a 3-year AWS contract and a data sovereignty requirement in the EU is a different conversation.
There's also the token optimization problem, which I think is more subtle, but potentially more significant over time. When you own your loop, your incentives and your costs are perfectly aligned. You want to minimize token usage because you pay for it. When Anthropic owns your loop,
their incentives are not the same as yours. The HN thread flagged this directly. Anthropic's harness has no structural reason to aggressively implement token-saving strategies. Prompt caching, context compression, smart routing to cheaper models for simpler subtasks. These are all optimizations a sophisticated developer would build into their own loop. Managed agents may implement some of them, but the financial incentive to do so is, at minimum, weaker. That's not an accusation, it's just an honest acknowledgement of how incentive structures work.
Although, to be fair, Anthropic does mention built-in prompt caching and compaction as features, so they're not ignoring it entirely.
They're not ignoring it, and that's worth acknowledging. But built-in and optimized for your specific cost profile are different things. The question isn't whether caching exists, it's whether the caching strategy is as aggressive as what you'd build yourself when every dollar of API spend comes directly out of your margin.
Let's talk about the OpenAI Assistance API comparison properly, because I think this is the most important historical parallel, and it's not getting enough attention in the coverage.
OpenAI launched Assistance in late 2023, and the developer community's reaction followed a predictable arc. Initial excitement, then growing frustration with opacity, you couldn't see what was happening inside the loop, debugging was painful, the pricing felt unpredictable. Then, the critique crystallized around lock-in and the sense that the abstraction was leaking in all the wrong places. OpenAI deprecated it in 2025 and replaced it with the Responses API, which moves in the opposite direction. More developer control, not less. You manage your own conversation history and tool orchestration.
So OpenAI tried the managed abstraction, got burned, and retreated. And Anthropic is launching a managed abstraction. That's a bold move or a learning opportunity, depending on how you look at it.
The question is whether Anthropic learned the right lessons. I think there are 2 genuine differences that might make this a different outcome. First, the compute layer. Assistance API was state management on top of the model. Managed agents is compute plus state plus governance. The Linux container is not a cosmetic addition. It means the abstraction is providing something you genuinely can't replicate with just the messages API and some clever code. Second, the governance layer. Scoped permissions, identity management, execution tracing, these are things that enterprise customers need and that are genuinely painful to build correctly. The Assistance API didn't have this. Managed Agents does.
But here's where I'd push back slightly. The features that would make this most compelling. Multi-agent coordination, where one agent spawns and directs sub-agents, and the outcomes feature where Claude self-evaluates and iterates until it meets defined success criteria. Those are not in the public beta. They're in research preview, which means a separate access request.
That's a real limitation, and I'm glad Daniel flagged it in the prompt, because the launch coverage kind of glosses over it. The headline capability, autonomous multi-agent orchestration as a managed service, is not what you get when you sign up today. What you get is a solid, well-governed single-agent runtime, which is valuable, but it's not the same as what the marketing implies.
The outcomes feature in particular is interesting to me. The internal testing showed up to 10 points improvement in structured file generation success compared to a standard prompting loop. That's not nothing. But it's also not something you can use yet unless you get into the research preview.
And the multi-agent coordination piece is where the really interesting architectural questions live. Because right now, if you want agents spawning sub-agents, you're building that yourself on top of the Messages API. Managed Agents promises to make that a platform primitive, but it's not there yet.
Okay, let's do the audience segmentation, because I think Daniel's question about who this is actually for is the most practically useful framing. 3 groups: startups, enterprises, sophisticated developers who already have a working loop.
Startups are the clearest case. If you are pre-product market fit and you need a tool using workflow that runs reliably over time, the calculus is straightforward. 3 to 6 months of infrastructure work, sandboxing, checkpointing, credential management, execution tracing is 3 to 6 months you're not spending on your actual product. 8 cents per session hour is cheap compared to an engineer's fully loaded cost. Blockit went from idea to shipping a meeting prep agent in days. Vibecode called it 10 times faster than their previous setup. For startups, this is not a hard decision.
The Sentry example is interesting to me because it's a more mature company making a pragmatic choice. They already had SIA, their existing debugging agent. They paired it with a managed agent to write the patch and open the PR. The quote from their engineering director was about eliminating ongoing operational overhead, not about getting to market faster. That's a different value proposition, not. We couldn't have built this otherwise, but we don't want to maintain this ourselves.
That's actually the more durable value proposition for the mid-market. The build versus buy calculation isn't just about initial development time, it's about ongoing maintenance as models update, as the agentic patterns evolve, as you need to add new tools. Outsourcing that maintenance to Anthropic has real value, even if you're technically capable of building it yourself.
Enterprises in regulated industries are the strongest case, I think. The governance layer, scoped permissions, identity management, execution tracing, is table stakes for financial services or healthcare. And it's genuinely hard to build correctly. The Rakuten deployment is the clearest proof point. 5 specialist agents across product, sales, marketing, finance, and HR, each deployed in under a week, each plugged into Slack and Teams, returning structured deliverables. That's a real enterprise deployment at real speed.
But then you hit the multi-cloud wall, and for a lot of enterprises, that wall is not negotiable. Data residency requirements, existing cloud commitments, security review processes that only cover approved cloud providers. These are not things you can work around with a compelling demo. Bedrock and Vertex support would change the enterprise calculus significantly. Without it, managed agent stays in the startup and mid-market lane for most heavily regulated sectors.
And then there's the sophisticated developer who already has a working loop, which is probably the most interesting group to think about, because they're the ones who are going to have the most nuanced reaction.
The honest answer for that group is, if your custom loop is a feature, not accidental plumbing, stay on the Messages API. If you need multi-model mixing, stay on the Messages API. If you need multi-cloud, stay on the Messages API. But if you've built a loop that works and you're spending meaningful engineering time maintaining the infrastructure around it, the sandboxing, the checkpointing, the credential rotation, then the migration cost calculation is worth doing seriously.
Let's talk about the OpenClaw situation, because I think it's impossible to discuss this launch without it, and Daniel's prompt touches on the timing.
The sequence is pretty damning in terms of optics, even if each individual decision is defensible. OpenClaw accumulates 100,000 GitHub stars by January. Anthropic implements technical safeguards against third-party tools spoofing Claude code. Anthropic adds OpenClaw's most popular features, Discord and Telegram messaging, into Claude code directly. Then, on April 4th, 4 days before the managed agents launch, Anthropic cuts third-party harness tools from Claude's subscription access. Individual OpenClaw agents were consuming between $1,000 and $5,000 per day in API costs. Then managed agents launches.
Peter Steinberger, who created OpenClaw and is now at OpenAI, said explicitly that he and Dave Morin tried to talk sense into Anthropic, and the best they managed was delaying it by a week. And then he noted that the timing meshed up with Anthropic copying popular features into their closed harness before locking out open source.
The embrace, extend, extinguish framing is the obvious read. But I want to be fair to the counterargument, which is this predatory? Or is it just what platform companies do when the open source ecosystem is consuming resources at a scale the platform wasn't designed for? Austin Parker from Honeycomb made the point that OpenClaw was waking up every 5 minutes to check what it should do next using Opus models. That is genuinely heavy usage that wasn't the intended pattern for a subscription product.
The conflict of interest concern that came up in the HN thread is real, though. Boris Cherny, who heads Claude Code at Anthropic, said the subscriptions weren't designed for third-party tool usage patterns, and that they were prioritizing their own products and API customers, which is a reasonable business decision. But it does mean that the open-source developer who built a workflow on top of Claude's subscription access now has to either pay-as-you-go API rates or migrate to managed agents. Those aren't neutral options.
The Brendan O'Leary take from Kilo Code is the most useful framing I've seen. Most workflows built around OpenClaw weren't tied to Anthropic specifically. They were using Claude for inference, and the model was interchangeable. What the subscription cutoff does is force developers to be more intentional about how they select models and source inference. Bring your own keys, use a gateway, or accept that a subscription locks you into one provider's ecosystem. That's the real choice being surfaced.
There's also the HN comment from CWs that I think is the sharpest read on the strategic picture. To score a big IPO, Anthropic needs to be a platform, not just a token pipeline. Claude Code hit $1 billion in run rate revenue within 6 months of its May 2025 launch. The enterprise customer list, Netflix, Spotify, KPMG, Salesforce, is real. The Snowflake partnership for $200 million to embed agentic AI in enterprise data workflows is real. The strategic logic of capturing not just model inference spend, but the entire agent operational stack is completely coherent.
The Patrick Kidger comment on HN is also worth acknowledging, even if it's a bit uncharitable. He called it AWSification, an increasing suite of products that seem undifferentiated among themselves, drawn from the same roulette wheel of words. Claude Managed Agents, Claude Agent SDK, Claude API, Claude Code, Claude Platform, Claude Enterprise. He said he's retreated to just the API plus a minimal library, and I think that reaction reflects a genuine usability concern. The product surface area is expanding faster than the documentation can explain how the pieces relate to each other.
The 3-tier decision framework that Anthropic published in their own docs is actually pretty honest about this. Managed agents if you want Anthropic to host the runtime for long-running async work. Messages. API if you want your own custom loop with maximum control. Agent SDK if you want agent logic that runs inside your own process and deployment. The critical distinction between managed agents and the SDK is that the SDK runs in your environment. Managed agents runs in Anthropic's infrastructure. One is a library, one is a service.
And that distinction matters for how you think about debugging. With the SDK and your own loop, you have full observability into every step. With managed agents, you have the execution tracing in the Claude console, which is good, but it's Anthropic's view of what happened, not your own instrumentation. That's a meaningful difference for production incident response.
I want to bring up the output governance point, because I think it's the most underappreciated issue in this whole discussion. There's a Hacker News comment from Jagetskow that I think is genuinely the most insightful thing in that thread. The observation is, managed agent solves access governance. Can the agent touch this system safely? But it doesn't solve output governance, which is what the agent produced actually correct?
The numbers here are sobering. Veracode found that 45% of AI-generated code contains security vulnerabilities. GitClear found that code duplication has quadrupled as AI coding tools have proliferated. Managed agents runs these agents unsupervised for hours. The sandboxing prevents the agent from doing unauthorized things. It does not prevent the agent from doing authorized things badly. Those are different problems, and only one of them is being solved.
And the outcomes feature in Research Preview, where Claude self-evaluates and iterates until it meets defined success criteria. is clearly gesturing at this problem. But it's not in the public beta, and even when it ships, self-evaluation by the same model that generated the output is not the same as independent verification. You're asking the agent to grade its own homework.
The output governance layer is genuinely wide open. Nobody is building it well yet. And as you scale autonomous agents that run for hours in open PRs without human review, that gap becomes increasingly consequential.
Practical takeaways. If you're a developer evaluating this right now, what's the decision tree?
Start with whether you need multi-model mixing. If yes, stay on the Messages API, full stop. If you need Bedrock or Vertex for compliance or existing cloud commitments, same answer. If neither of those is a constraint, then ask whether your current agent infrastructure is a feature or accidental plumbing. If you've built a custom loop that gives you competitive differentiation, unusual state transitions, cost-optimized routing, bespoke orchestration patterns, the migration cost likely exceeds the infrastructure savings. But if your loop exists because you had to build it and you'd rather not maintain it, the 8 cents per session hour is worth pricing out seriously.
For enterprises specifically, the governance story is compelling enough to justify a serious evaluation, even if you end up not adopting it. Scoped permissions, identity management, execution tracing. Knowing what it would take to build those yourself is useful context for the build versus buy decision.
And for startups, if your pre-product market fit and your core value proposition is not the agent infrastructure itself, this is probably the right call. The vibe code and block-it examples are real. Days to shipping instead of months is a real thing.
One thing I'd flag for anyone evaluating it today, the multi-agent coordination and outcomes features are in research preview, not public beta. If those are the features that make the product compelling for your use case, you're not evaluating the product that exists. You're evaluating the product that's coming. That's a different decision.
The James Lock framing from HN is worth sitting with. We're in the CGI scripts and webmasters era of agentic AI. Every framework is reinvented every week. Locking into any framework, including Anthropic's, is a risk for anyone trying to stay competitive. The counter-argument is that Rails didn't emerge from everyone building their own web server. Sometimes the managed abstraction wins because the underlying complexity genuinely isn't your competitive advantage. Whether agent orchestration infrastructure is like database management, outsource it, or like your core business logic, own it, is the question every team needs to answer for themselves.
And the honest answer is probably, it depends what you're building and whether the thing that makes you valuable is inside or outside the loop.
Which is not a satisfying answer, but it's the true one.
That's the job. Alright, I think we've given this a proper treatment. The short version, Managed Agents, is more interesting than it looks on the surface, more limited than the launch marketing implies, and the strategic context around OpenClaw makes the timing hard to ignore. The output governance gap is the thing nobody is talking about that probably matters most in the long run.
And the multi-cloud limitation is the quiet constraint that will determine whether this gets serious enterprise traction or stays in the startup lane. Worth watching how that develops.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping this whole operation running. Big thanks to Modal for the GPU credits that power the show. Genuinely couldn't do this without them. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you want to find us, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram and you'll get notified when new episodes drop. See you next time.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We shake